Alright, good evening, good afternoon, one of those two. Um, this is going to be a presentation on Norbert Rillieux, an African-American chemical engineer. Uh, I'm Andre Johnson, if you couldn't tell. This is for Dr. Bergen's African-American science class. Alright, so Norbert Rillieux was born a free man of color in New Orleans, Louisiana on March 17th, 1806. He was baptized at the St. Louis Cathedral and was the oldest of 7 children. Norbert was educated at Catholic schools and then at, I'm not sure I pronounced that, but l'École Centrale in Paris. This was a postgraduate institution for higher research in education, engineering, and science. At this institution, Norbert became an instructor in applied mechanics. Around 1830, Norbert published a series of papers on steam engines and steam power. One of the most important things is during this time, the postgraduate institution was basically college. It was like basically like high school slash college. However, this was a huge deal because first of all, he was a man of color who was able to go out of the country to study somewhere else, which was really important. And there at that institution was really where he started to become quite infamous, especially amongst his peers and teachers. All right, so Norbert Rillieux's father was Vincent Rillieux, a wealthy white engineer and inventor. Vincent designed a successful steam-operated press for making bales of cotton. Constance Vivant was Vincent's slave wife, but she was eventually freed. Vincent and Constance had 7 children and all received good educations due to Vincent's wealth. So once again, this was before the Civil War and before slaves' complete freedom. Uh, so Vincent was not Vincent. Constance was Vincent's slave wife. Um, and since Vincent was a engineer, an inventor, his wealth really did help take care of the 7 children. All of them received Catholic education, which similar like now is sometimes viewed as better than public school education. So that was very important. And majority of their children, uh, just like Norbert and just like Vincent, they were all very intelligent, and a lot of them uh, went into areas of engineering and things of that sort. All right, so while in France, Rouleau began working on the multiple effect evaporator. So this was actually uh, it was the name of the machine that he was working on. Evaporators were well, not really evaporators, but before Rouleau released his evaporator, what happened on plantations was slaves were used to create sugar, basically. So there was cane sugar, and it had to be heated at different temperatures, and the slaves were the ones who had to, regulate the temperatures and specifically carry the residue. So like it would be heated at a certain temperature, the residue would be taken and moved to a different. They're called kettles, which had each kettle had a different temperature. So once the first kettle was done, you take the residue, move it to the second kettle. Once that was done, take the residue and move it. And the problem with this was that the containers holding the residue were extremely heavy, and as you could tell, they're extremely hot. So every time that you move between kettles, first of all, the exposure to air and the overall time consumption would lower the quality of the sugar. And then slaves, like the workers, almost every time that they moved the residue to between kettles, there was a chance that they'd drop it and kill themselves. Get themselves killed. So it was the process for making sugar was not necessarily the safest. Anyway, going on, an expert on sugar known as George Meade wrote in 1946, the great scientific contribution which Rillieux, I spelled that wrong, dang it, Rillieux made was in his recognition of the steam economies which can be effected by repeated use of the latent heat in the steam and vapors. So, me personally, I don't really understand this that much, but basically what he's saying is Rillieux basically noticed something that no other engineer really had noticed, which was you could keep using the steam that was used when heating the the sugar cane, whatever I guess it is. I'm not really sure what it's called, but it's like sugar cane. And when he by steam economies, he basically means like the chemicals and the steam that was released during the heating of the sugarcane. And moving on, what Rillieux did was he figured out how to harness the energy of vapors from the boiling sugarcane syrup. That's what it is, sugarcane syrup. And those vapors were passed through a series of chambers, leaving in the end sugar crystals. This newly designed evaporator was safer, cheaper, and more efficient. So basically, in simpler terms, what he found out how to do was completely remove the usage of, not completely, but he basically removed the usage and manual labor of slaves. Now, slaves still technically had to operate the machine, but it did one of two things. First of all, it increased the quality of the sugar crystals, which is what, sugar crystals. That's what sugar is. Sugar are just basically sugar crystals. And the making of sugar crystals, I forgot where I was going with this. Basically, uh, the okay, so the machine that Rillieux made found out how to quickly create, sugar crystals. And since it was able to create it within itself without needing manual labor, it basically made the quality better. There was no, you didn't have to depend on the movement of the slaves. You didn't have to depend on whether or not they would end up killing themselves. It was all in this one machine could do it by itself. Once again, the slaves still had to operate it, but it was not nearly the same as like carrying these gigantic kettles of residue and stuff that could kill them very easily. Um, so yeah, that's just that part. All right, so here we just have a couple pictures of Norbert Rillieux. Unfortunately, tons of sites use the exact same pictures. These are the two most common that pop up. Um, so yeah, this is what he looked like. All right, so when Rillieux made this breakthrough with the evaporator, the invention very quickly spread to the United States. In the early 1830s, Rillieux returned to New Orleans. Now, the site I used said that this was coincidentally with, like when he returned to New Orleans, this was the same time as the sugar boom. It was coincidental. The sugar boom didn't happen because of Rillieux. Um, so part of partially some part of me, not part of me, but some of it is what he did. And then some of it is also just the greater demand for sugar mainly. Okay, so Rillieux continued to work on his evaporator for the next decade. Now, here something is very important for future slides. So during this decade, it's said that he worked on his evaporator. He's trying to perfect it. However, about twice he was hired to, well, not really hired, but he was offered to work in some very big name sugar refinery companies, basically. Now, both times Rillieux ended up not getting hired for those positions. The first time, his father told him not to go there because his father was also, um, you know, the big name engineer with the same, basically the same companies. And so, out of loyalty, he decided not to get hired by the first one. The second one, however, there was an employer, Edmund. I don't remember his last name, but Edmund really wanted Rillieux to work, but didn't happen. So that was a problem. Anyway, moving on. In 1843, Rillieux was hired to install an evaporator on Judah Benjamin's Belchassi plantation. Benjamin was a Jewish lawyer who served as a Secretary of War in the Confederacy. After Rillieux installed the evaporator, Benjamin became one of Rillieux's most dedicated supporters within Louisiana's sugar circles. In 1846, Benjamin wrote that Rillieux's his sugar, was equal to the best double refined sugar of our northern refineries. Okay, if anyone didn't catch this, this is actually freaking hilarious. So please understand, this is a man of color who installed an evaporator on a slave plantation, correct? Right, okay. The owner of this plantation became the Secretary of War in the Confederacy. And if you remember, Confederate people were pro-slavery. So it's extremely impressive for a black man. And now, mind you, Rillieux deserved this. However, it's impressive that Rillieux, he didn't seek this praise, but he earned the praise of a Confederate plantation owner. Mind you, this is Secretary of War. It's not like he was just a soldier, like the Secretary of War. Now, of course, being the whole Secretary of War, this happened after Rillieux installed the plantation. However, this should this should speak for itself that Benjamin wasn't one of those plantation owners that was like, nice to slaves or was kind of iffy about slavery or anti-slavery. He was with the Confederacy, which means that he wanted slavery to continue. So just that Rillieux earned his respect, I personally think is a very important thing. And then the other thing that you have to remember is that the South and the North, even to this day, are very different. During those times, oftentimes, if the South and North produced the same thing, the North had more money and did it better. So in order for Benjamin to say was equal to the best double refined sugar of our northern refineries, meaning that, northern refineries having their already perfect sugar and doing it twice is equal to the production of Rillieux's machine. That's extremely, extremely high praise. So please keep that in mind. All right, so one of the things that we had to talk about was how Rillieux and, how our scientists uh, basically interacted with and affected society. All right. So before I go into this, before I start talking about this slide, what I want to say is, in the previous slide we did talk about how he was perceived slightly. Like we kind of got into how he was perceived. He did receive a lot of praise, and when he did return to Louisiana, he immediately gained lots of profit and wealth just right off the bat, mainly because, this is a huge breakthrough. This is very important. And in addition to the sugar boom, it became in high demand. So that's the kind of beginning of that. So going on here, when Norbert moved back to Louisiana in the 1830s, the Civil War hadn't happened yet, so please keep that in mind. Norbert was acknowledged as the most sought-after engineer in the state. Yes, he was. But he was still a man of color. Still a man of color. So, what's really important here is Rillieux was, the engineer and designer of this evaporator, and he would be asked to go around and install evaporators on plantations. This would take more than one day. Now, I don't know how long it would take, but however, I do know that it would take more than one day, so I'm probably thinking maybe like 3 to 4 days, maybe. And And so here's the thing. So Rillieux, who went out of the country and designed something as revolutionary as the multi-effect evaporator, was still treated, as if he was worth less. And so there were two options when he went to a plantation, right? He would either spend the night in in the guest room of the plantation owner, which was you know considered to be fitting of his status. It would be fitting of his status. However, on other occasions, he would be asked to, not even asked, he had to sleep in the slave quarters, which is, not in a bad way, but that's below him. I mean, once again, he received a higher education than a lot of white men did. And so, in order to, once again, go out of the country and do something as huge as this and come back and have to spend 2 to 4 nights in a slave quarters and still be expected to, do his job faithfully, it's not, it's not fair. Anyway, so moving on past that, once again, he was one of the most famous engineers in the state and wasn't receiving the treatment he felt fit. And Rillieux moved back to France and was found, well, okay, so he moved back to France and he ended up developing a love for Egypt. Now, I wasn't given dates for this. However, I do know that he often went to Egypt and studied what was there. And he actually was found deciphering hieroglyphics in 1880. All right, so here I have two pictures of the evaporator that Rillieux designed. Now it's very complicated. It doesn't look that complicated, but it is complicated. So if you look on the top, that's the original one of the original written blueprints. If you look on the bottom, it explains what's going on. So as you can see, there's steam generator. So you put in cane juice, high pressure kettle, and then the residue was taken and put into a medium pressure. Uh, then once that's done, it's taken back out and go in the lower pressure. And then once that's done, you have your sugar crystals. And then this whole time, the steam is constantly being reused. And there's also a condenser that is putting it back to its original form so that it's still useful. Now, if you're looking at all those red lines, so okay, so here let's picture this. So where you see high pressure, medium pressure, low pressure, right? Those three. So I want you to imagine those being about, not even, about 10 times your size, right? And at the bottom, you see that there are those little lines with the, circular at the end, at the bottom, with the sugars going out and back into the next kettle. So imagine carrying something like that and having to move something like that. And mind you, these are these huge, gigantic containers of just, this heated residue and having to move that between kettles. And this is, all day. It wasn't uncommon for slaves to die from this. It's like they're extremely heavy, accidents happen. But it it's not too obvious, but try to imagine how much less work had to be done by slaves in order for this to, to be done. I mean, all they really have to do is like, they have to still regulate temperatures and, turn knobs and this and stuff like that and, watch it and stuff like that, but it's not nearly the same as the amount of physical labor that was necessary for it. All right, so Norbert Rillieux died at the age of 89 in 1894, which is pretty impressive for that time. Norbert was wealthy enough for his wife Emily Cacao, I don't know, to live, I spelled that wrong, to live comfortably for the next 18 years. Now, of course, by next 18 years, I mean until she died. Rillieux was buried in the Paris cemetery of Paris, Père Lachaise, I think. Norbert not only contributed to the sugar industry, but also helped save Louisiana from a yellow fever outbreak. So, remember when I talked all the way back about Edmund? So, did I put his name in here? Edmund Forstall, right? So, originally, Edmund and Norbert they kind of clashed a little bit, all right? So, there was some bad blood between them, right? Before Norbert Rillieux moved back to France, there was a disgustingly terrible yellow fever outbreak. And as you know, yellow fever is carried by mosquitoes. Now, during this time, Louisiana was surrounded, not necessarily surrounded, but there were there were lots of swamplands around there, all right? And so, if you guys don't know, basically swamplands is a swamp is the perfect place for the birth of mosquitoes. It's perfect, all right? In case you didn't know, now you know. And so basically, Rillieux, being an engineer, met with the state legislature, and he said, "Okay, I'm an engineer. Here's two things you can do. First, drain the swamplands, because then that removes where they are born. And then he said, here's step two, improve the sewer system." Now, the interesting thing is that, well, that's kind of off topic. But anyway, basically, that's what he said that we should do, right? That's what he said they should do. Edmund, who was a member of the state legislature, turned the entire legislature against him, where they completely refuted his plan, right? Completely. And, after being refused because you're black and also not being treated how you see fit, you can kind of imagine why he left. Now, of course, in France, no one really cared. So, of course, in France, he has like so much more freedom, and he wasn't really seen as a hero, but he was highly respected because of his accomplishments and breakthrough once again with the evaporator. So he did move back to France. Now, I said shortly after Lou moved back to France. I mean about 5 to 10 years after he moved back to France. Now, in this 5 to 10 year frame, the yellow fever got worse, killed more people. All right, but after about 5 to 10 years, white engineers offered pretty much the exact same plan, and that was used to stop the outbreak. Once again, I'm pretty sure you can see why he left. First of all, you're not being treated as you see fit. I mean, you create one of the most revolutionary machines in the world, basically, and the basics of it is still used today. And he was asked to sleep in slave quarters, and then he offers a plan to save lives, and is completely dismissed because he's black. Or not even black, because he's a man of color. And it's absolutely like absurd. And it's not fair at all. So you can see why he moved back to France. Now, of course, his wife, Emily Cacot, there was no information on when they got married. So that I don't know, but I do know that they were buried in the same place. And there's also a memorial, very nice memorial for Norbert Rillieux. All right, so here we have a few pictures of his memorial. On the left, there's I'm not sure what to really call it. I forget the name of it, but there's like a small, like a statue of him. And on the right, there's once again a memorial, a little plaque that says that he's buried here. So yeah, just a couple pictures. Okay, so this slide doesn't really need the voiceover, but I'll do it anyway. These are the only sites that I really used. These are the only sites I used. Um, unsurprisingly, there is a lot of information on Rillieux. However, specifically, the last two sites have lots of information that also explain the scientific process behind his evaporator. And the first two were essential in his early life and also understanding a bit more about his parents. Now, of course, there wasn't much to be said about his mom and his dad, and neither was there much to be said about his siblings. However, you know, Ancestry.com, it worked out. So yeah, good information. This is all I really needed. But I'm pretty sure if I kept looking, there would have been a lot of more information that could have been found. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And this will be the end of my presentation on Robert Rillieux.